Hey, hello everybody. Welcome everyone to a special live edition of Zoom In, Women Making Impacts, held in honor of International Women's Day. The VIUFA Status of Women Committee is grateful to live, work, and learn on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional territories of the Snuneymuxw, Snonoas, Quetson, Comox, and Slayamaman First Nations. I thank the VIUFA Status of Women and VIU Faculty Association, Human Rights and International Solidarity Committees for funding this event. Just please note that this is a supportive space for learning and for mutual respect. Please be considerate in your chat communications. Moderators will remove participants if they're disrespectful or hateful. Please note too that we will be prioritizing panelists' perspectives today, given the limited time that we have, but non-panelists are definitely welcome to communicate questions and comments in the chat section. My name is Dr. Melissa Stevens, and I'm the VIU Faculty Association Chair for the Status of Women Committee and a professor in English. My research is focused on Black feminisms and creative projects that critique neoliberal globalization. I see a necessary relationship between research, teaching, activism, and I believe that universities have a public duty to serve their communities. My co-moderator, Hannah Crawford, is a graduate student in social work and is currently employed in the Kwemut Lalem Child and Family Services on Snuneymuxw First Nation as a case aide. She's passionate about empowering children and families who interact with government systems, and she's an advocate for the rights of children in care. Hannah is a mother to a toddler and is loved and supported by her partner, Jordan. Her experience also includes working alongside Dr. Cindy Blackstock at the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, caring for children and families at the Saskatoon Crisis Nursery. And she is published author on the subject of sexual minority women's experiences and World War II concentration camps. As a bisexual woman with chronic illness, Hannah is familiar with systems of oppression through both learned and lived experience, and she's grateful to contribute to the facilitation and moderation of this panel. So we unite here in honor of International Women's Day, Women's History Month, but also to acknowledge that homelessness and insecure housing is a national and global crisis. Many women experiencing temporary, periodic, and chronic homelessness also experience trauma, violence, health adversity, economic insecurity. Pandemic conditions exacerbate these effects, intensifying the burden of care expected of women. We must defend anti-racism, feminism, and human rights while combating misinformation about homelessness and affordable housing to address the distinct challenges that diverse women in particular face. I hope this event offers education and that it inspires citizen action. I realize that many of you are very experienced advocates working on this issue, and so I look forward to learning more from you here and at future events. This topic obviously needs ongoing attention and action. So we've asked our panelists to share their time and expertise with us in particular ways, and I thank them very much for being here. And this event is also about honoring the work that they do. And thanks to everyone for coming here to listen. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's just going to be offering us a really important but brief reflection on women, racism, and COVID-19. Dr. Imogene Lim is a descendant of Cumberland and Vancouver's Chinatowns, who teaches in anthropology and in global studies at VIU. Her paternal grandfather paid the head tax when he landed in Victoria in 1890. Although she conducted her dissertation research in Tanzania with Swahili as her first language, she is known for her expertise in Chinese Canadian communities, especially on Vancouver Island. Her community engagement spans 2 decades, including collaboration with local museums. She co-developed the exhibit 150 Years and Counting, Fighting for Justice on the Coast, 2017. At VIU, Dr. Lim is chair of VIUFA's Human Rights and International Solidarity Committee, and also sits on the President's Council on Diversity, Equity, and Human Rights. So I pass it over to Imogene. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the ancestral lands of the Snuneymuxw peoples. So I'm really pleased to be able to offer a few thoughts. one of the things about what is going on with COVID-19 is that there has been a rise in anti-Asian racism. And it's actually a rather complicated topic, because to say you are Asian, you're not acknowledging the various nuances of how one's family arrive to Canada or to other countries, because we know the diaspora exists around the world. And what we've seen with COVID-19 is a rise in anti-Asian racism worldwide. So it's actually given certain political parties and groups a means to latch on to the COVID-19 crisis and to, in fact, promote anti-immigrant and white supremacist and nationalist, basically xenophobic conspiracy theories. One of the things that I would like us to think about is that certainly in Canada and the United States, many healthcare providers are women. And one of the groups of people that I would like to sort of point out is Filipino women. So Filipino women have come, so I'll just speak to the Canadian example. Filipino women have come to Canada, many initially through the live-in caregivers program. So we know that when they came, they did not come with the acknowledgement of their full expertise. So many people actually were nurses. They were well respected in their own country of the Philippines. They come here and they're just viewed as basically underpaid nannies as such. And some have been given the opportunity through upgrading to get to be recognized for their nursing profession. But then if you think about the impact of COVID-19, it has been very high amongst the Filipino community. And it's because they are often as the long-term caregivers. And we know what that scenario is about. It is fairly well publicized, the impact on that particular community. The other thing, besides the Filipino community being in the caregiving role, I want you to also consider other women who identify as Asian. And as I said, that notion of Asian it doesn't tell you enough. In any case, besides being nurses, they can be doctors. So imagine that you've dedicated your life to, we know that going into medicine, that's a lot of years. So you get the education, you're there, say you're in ER and a patient comes to you and they said, "You're not my doctor. I refuse to be seen by you." So how does that person feel? Because you know that our medical care professionals, part of the reason they're in this is they care about people. It's not about what color they are or anything else. It's that they can do service to their community. So it's one of those reminders of the impact on COVID-19 to, like I said, healthcare providers, whether you are at the lowest level to the highest level, there has been an impact. The other point that I would like to make is that, as a person who is perceived as and recognized as Asian, all of us, if we are not Indigenous, we are immigrants. So when you have this rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, this is where you are blatantly saying race matters. And race, we know, is a social construct. So I'm just going to leave it at that because I'm not expected to go on, but I just wanted to make those couple of points. So thank you, Melissa, for having me.
Thank you so much, Imogene. I'll turn it over to Hannah, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm pleased to introduce Aimee Chalifoux, who is a outreach support coordinator at the Society for Equity, Inclusion and Advocacy, and is the Indigenous Literacy Coordinator at Literacy Central. Aimee Chalifoux is a Métis Cree girl who grew up in Nanaimo, BC. She works as an outreach support coordinator for SIA and is blessed to be able to support women to find services that they need and advocate for them as needed. She gets to work with some of Nanaimo's hidden heroes. Aimee's newer role at Literacy Central as an Indigenous Literacy Coordinator helps her to have the opportunity to connect people with tutors and create programs on language revitalization and literacy wellness in our community. Aimee is the mother of 4 and grandmother to 2. She loves to write poetry and short stories that raise awareness about sexual exploitation, addiction, and racism.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really, really grateful to be here. I'm very humbled by the hard work that you all do. I know a lot about what you have done for our community, and I'm super honored that you even considered me for today. So thank you. I first want to acknowledge that I'm very grateful to live and learn and work on the territory of the Snuneymuxw people. I've been here most of my life, even though I'm not from here originally. I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, and I am Métis and Cree and also Saulteaux. I have been working at, well, I guess it's SIA, but we were formerly Nanaimo Women's Resources Society and Citizens Advocacy, and we have since merged as one. But I was with Nanaimo Women's Resources for 6 years, and I'm now going into my 7th year since the merger. And I cannot talk about the people that I work with enough, and the praises. It really gets to see the behind the scenes stuff. And we really do have an amazing team of people. We've just recently opened up our resource room again, and we're going to be having our grand opening to welcome back the women that we haven't been able to keep in touch with since COVID. So I'm really excited about that. And in my outreach role, I get to stay in touch with those people because, I know where they all are. And so I go from places like Bowen Park and down at the mall, Tim Hortons. I've been in Nanaimo all my life, so I tend to know where they kind of hang out. And my work, sorry if that background noise is bothering anybody, but my work has been extremely supportive of everything that I do. I don't just do it alone. We have partnerships in the community that keep us going. We rely on volunteers really heavily. We have, and if it wasn't for the women, that are there, that's who keeps us coming every day. And I wanted to talk about some of the misconceptions about what homelessness looks like. It doesn't all look the same, and it can happen to any of us. I've been homeless. I was homeless as a child. I was homeless as a teen. I've been in situations as an adult where I was living out of my vehicle, and I see a lot of that. And that's one of my biggest concerns, is because I think that when people live in their cars, they tend to be a little bit, they tend to be more hidden, and they're maybe not accessing services as much. And as an outreach worker, you don't want to just walk up to people's cars and bang on their windows and ask them if they're homeless. So there's a lot of patience, and there's a lot of work that goes into gaining people's trust and getting to know them, and using my gut instincts. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've approached the wrong people. I've made people angry. But I think I've been doing it long enough that 9 times out of 10, I'm pretty close when I have a feeling that somebody is homeless. But I just want people to think about that when they see somebody, that there are so many different reasons that land people homeless. It could be when a woman leaves an abusive relationship. It could be, there's so many flaws within our government. Often women are in a long-term marriage, and everything is in her partner's name. So when she leaves, she's literally starting with nothing. She's got no credit. She's got no bank account. Myself, I was 30 years old before I had my own bank account. Before that, my money was always controlled by someone else. My social assistance check was in someone else's name. My child tax, my GST, all of it. I never seen any of it. And I don't know if a lot of people are aware that when you're in a partnership, um, whoever makes the most money, even if your children are not biologically your partners, because you claim together, your partner gets all of that, all your child tax, all your GST, your income tax, everything. And that puts a lot of women in danger. It puts them at risk when things go south. It's not easy for them to just get up and leave. So I think a lot of us, are too quick to judge women for staying in a situation like that because we don't know how hard it is for them to leave. And sometimes they're choosing homelessness, or they have to stay in a shelter and start all over again. And that's difficult too. Thank God for Haven Society here in Nanaimo. I've been through Haven, years ago with my kids, and I ended up becoming a volunteer there. And I'm super grateful because it was a really lengthy training. I learned a lot, and I discovered that I wanted to give back. I spent a lot of time being homeless. I spent time as a sexually exploited youth, um, and continued in the sex trade as an adult because it was what I knew. And it tended to be what I fell back on as a survival technique. But I got out, and it doesn't mean that the women that are out there that are still in that lifestyle, it's never my job to rescue them, to say, hey, there's a way out if you want it. My job is to get to know them, be there for them, support them however I can, whether that's helping them find housing lists, helping them get into treatment, helping them find counseling, helping them find someone to help them do their income taxes, all sorts of things, teach them what their rights are, help making sure that they get medical attention. And then if they choose that they want that help, then you know what? They have somebody that they can come to. That's what it's about. For me, it's just about bringing dignity to their lives. We all deserve that, no matter what our situation. And as for memories of resilience, I could go on for hours and hours about that. I feel so blessed that I get to see women once they've rebuilt their lives. I've worked with women that, I knew from the streets. I've seen so many successes. I see them all the time. And it's what keeps me going back to doing this kind of work. And then a few months ago, I guess back in October, I joined the team at Literacy Nanaimo. Many that know me know how passionate I am about anything to do with books and literacy writing. I love to write stories and poetry. I'm working on my memoir. And joining this place really put everything in perspective for me. I really feel like I came full circle. I love my job at SIA, and I'm still there. I'm still very much involved with SIA. But here at Literacy Central, I'm having a hard time putting it into words. And I don't mean this in a bad way, so please. I love my job at SIA, but it's really heavy some days. And I feel like when I come to literacy, I feel like I'm bringing light into people's lives. When you talk about literacy wellness, all those little things, I talk with people out on the streets about being connected with their Indigenous language. And I don't even speak my own fluently, but with my resources that I have here at Literacy, I've been able to help people get reconnected with resources for their language, and for just everything from learning how to navigate their own written documents to working on their upgrading, getting back into school. There's so much that goes on in this place. And I was really excited about this job because I've watched how much Literacy Central has grown over the last few years and continues to grow. The programs are continually growing. There's not one time that I have gone to my employer with an idea that I haven't not only gotten support, I've gotten excited support. And I get quite emotional when I talk about it because I'm so passionate about it. I just have little notes here. I want to make sure I didn't forget anything. So I'm connecting people with tutors and creating programs on language revitalization and literacy wellness. there's a portion of my job that involves research. So the relationships that I've made with the homeless population here in Nanaimo, I get to continue that role in a literacy with my literacy hat as well. And they're excited as much as I am about it. So I hope I didn't forget anything, but I just wanted to once again thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Aimee. You've been a wonderful contributor to this community in so many ways, and I'm so excited for you in this new role at the Literacy Center. It's so vital. And you've also been a wonderful speaker at women's marches in the past, and I know we can't all meet together in person this year, but thank you so much for everything you do. I know you have a busy schedule today, so Aimee may have to leave at some point, but I just wanted to take the time now to thank you so very much for your contributions and for the stories of strength and resilience, right? It's a heavy job that you take on, but you also have these beautiful stories to share with us that are uplifting. So thank you so very much. I appreciate that. I'd like to introduce our next speaker then. We have Hawa Mire, who is Principal Consultant at HYMIRE Consulting. Hawa Mire is a proven strategic senior leader, equity consultant, and community organizer with 2 decades of nonprofit experience focused on high impact community development. In 2017, she completed a master's degree in environmental studies at York University, where her research examined community storytelling as a place of transformation. Hawa is a critical writer, commentator, and columnist for Ricochet Media, and has been featured on Maclean's, Briar Patch Magazine, Metro Morning, CBC, City TV, Rabble, among others. She's also the NDP candidate for York South-Weston. Hawa, thank you.
Hi, Melissa, thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Aimee, for sharing your experience and your words. I was also left moved. I want to first start by thanking the really fierce and brilliant feminists and women who have shared both their wisdom with me in the past and now, and likely will continue to do so in the future if my grandparents are any indication. I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm currently based in Tekaronto, Toronto, which is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Petun First Nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the Seneca. It's really important not just for me to provide a land acknowledgement, but for me to make sure that folks understand, from my perspective, coming from parents who are refugees to this country, the same processes of colonialism, of settler colonialism, displaced us from our territory and brought us here. So being in solidarity with organizing around issues of systemic racism are deeply embedded in my work here, because they're also deeply embedded in my family's experience in a number of different spaces. So those pieces are never disconnected or far away from my thinking. My name is Hawa Mire. I've worked for 2 decades of my life in what I call housing adjacent or integrative housing, meaning that so much of our lives are taken up by housing, whether or not we actually give it attention or peace of mind. And it's no more vital or critical than now during a global pandemic to think of housing. And I don't just talk about it in the context of my work, but so much of my life is around this idea of where I live, when I live, where my community lives, when they live, how safe they feel, how accessible it is. All of these things come up as central questions in how we feel comfortable and safe. And one example that many of you may know, when we were asked to all work from home, what did that mean for people last year to be asked to work from home? It meant for many folks taking calls in vehicles if they had them, for others taking calls in bathrooms and hallways, trying to struggle to figure out how to live with other people who were also being asked to be at home without maybe the safety and security that many of us take for granted every day. There's this sense that we're all in this together because of COVID-19. We're absolutely not in this together. We haven't been for a very long time. Some of us have very different experiences than others of us. We've maybe been more attentive to those differences in the last couple of months. but it likely, as the vaccine approaches and we think about vaccine distribution, we'll grow more inattentive to those differences as we move forward. The idea that many have raised around building back better, again, makes me want to think about who we're building back for, and once we've built back enough, who will we again forget? In particular, Indigenous women, racialized women, and Black women who are living at the intersections of immigration, sexual orientation, gender identity, disabilities. We've all felt the consequences of this pandemic fairly starkly. And so when I think about how to share some remarks, when I think about any kind of significant issue or barrier that people are experiencing around housing, particularly women, I have to first talk about this inattention to the inattention of our government to a systemic anti-racism plan. We don't have an actionable systemic anti-racist plan. This is, I think, a glaring gap when we think about anything to do with housing, and the cascading historical impacts that, again, have been largely unattended to for Black people in particular in this country and Indigenous peoples of this land. So I can speak to the tangible barriers. I think others will likely do that fairly well, and I'll talk about a couple, which is, lack of government investment, a real lack of affordable housing, availability, safety of housing, accessibility of housing. But most of my time is going to be spent speaking to the systemic roots that underpin those tangible barriers. That's what makes them possible, and the unseen and social and psychological impacts that happen as a result. It is not just about not having housing. We know that not having housing contributes to increased levels of mental health, increased levels of health, general well-being and health, a sense of belonging, community cohesion, etc. There are consequences to a lack of affordable, accessible, and safe housing. And again, the folks who bear those consequences are not those who are often speaking to those consequences. In a very recent history, I worked with a local nonprofit, and I was responsible for an integrated employment and transitional housing hub, so 50-bed transitional housing unit, in addition to an employment center, a print shop, essentially a one-stop shop for young people who are experiencing homelessness. I worked with a team at the time to pull together a research report on young women who were experiencing homelessness, who kept coming back into the shelter system as a result of their mental health. Mild, very often depression, anxiety, nothing incredibly significant, but significant enough that it made it difficult for them to hold on to housing. I spent about half of my working career in BC. Ontario doesn't have supportive housing, so there's no in-between step between the shelter system and someone attempting to live on their own for the first time. BC could do a little more with that supportive housing model for sure, but the fact that it doesn't exist at all really shows up pretty starkly in a shelter environment. But what's always there, but never spoken about, is the vast numbers of Black and racialized young women that were experiencing this. It was very, very small amounts of young white women who were in that predicament. And so again, we don't talk about the racial implications for those who are outnumbering. So in general terms, I mean, I hope all of us in this space know this. We know that women are twice as likely to be victims of family violence or intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. We also know that women who are living on the streets or coming into the shelter system are at a higher risk of vulnerability than others because of the instability of moving from place to place on a night-to-night basis. But having to choose between a space that's safe and a space that's unsafe and a space that's unsafer, right, isn't much of a choice to offer anybody. And the fact that people are being put in the position of having to make those decisions on an everyday is, I think, what's at question here. And so ensuring the right to housing, and excellent people across the country doing this really excellent work, requires systemic and structural change. But this systemic and structural change also requires an actual action-oriented intersectional approach, not lip service to who we involve and when we involve them, not as a place to bring in people to speak to their lived experiences so that we can all pat ourselves on the back and feel like we did an excellent job, but as a way to actually create concrete strategies that are rooted and centered in the experiences of those who are most harmed. When we think about our women's movements, when we think about feminist movements, particularly in the context that they exist today, they center time and time again white, able-bodied, cisgendered women. There are not other groups that are centered. And so when we think about the leading voices of feminist movements across Canada, and those are the voices sitting at the table, we can see time and time again who gets removed from any of the conversations. So I'm not going to go into some of the misconceptions around housing and homelessness. I feel like Aimee did that in a really comprehensive way. But what I am going to say is that we know that the space between housing and homelessness is blurry and transitionary, particularly for women and particularly for Black and racialized and Indigenous women. This idea of hidden homelessness is incredibly real. Couch surfing, community supports, staying with a family, staying with another family, renting a room in a subsidized housing unit, getting kicked out because they find the rent will go up for the other occupants. These are very real experiences. And many of the folks who are involved in them will never say that they're experiencing homelessness. But the fact that they don't have a consistent place to go to day in and day out, and they're reliant on the support of a family network or a stranger network or a community-based network tells us quite a bit. So I'll maybe just end by saying that all of these systems are deeply integrative. We think about the fact that Black women make the least amount of money in comparison to their counterparts, but do the most amount of hours. We think about personal support workers as being the lowest paid work, and yet the most critical work when we're talking about building back our economy. When we think about who is asking for childcare and who is providing it, we have a national childcare movement that's focused on getting primarily middle-class white women's children into childcare. What about Black and racialized and Indigenous women? Where are their children going to go when they're doing the necessary work being on the front lines of our global pandemic? We really have to have these conversations in a much more nuanced and a much more critical way, because all of these pieces impact the way that we think about housing at a broad level. And so women's movements, housing, all of the ways that we talk about critical systemic issues, we can't continue to add Black and racialized and Indigenous women in as a footnote or an appendix or simply a lived experience into a pre-existing plan. What we really need is housing that engages with Black and racialized and Indigenous women as central stakeholders at the intersection of all the other systemic barriers that they might be coming up against. So I think if we're going to talk about recovery, which we're all talking about because we're in a COVID time, we really have to think about housing, but we have to think about housing in a much more nuanced way. And for anybody who's ever done frontline work around housing, you see it. It's not nuanced. It's actually quite apparent. It's very clear. So what happens between the front line and the level at which decisions are being made? What's the gap in between that some of us who are working in these spaces have to address? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for reminding us to prioritize who needs to be central and who the stakeholders are. And these are obviously racialized women, Indigenous women. And thank you so much for that. I know there are going to be lots of people wanting to ask questions about this and how to go about doing that in a practical way. So I'm going to hold off and we'll just move through the speakers and we'll come back to you for sure. Thank you so very much. Hannah, I'll turn it to you to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm happy to introduce Jennifer Fowler. Jennifer is the Executive Director of the Central Vancouver Island Multicultural Society based in Nanaimo. She has been in that role for just over 3 years. Before CVIMS, she was with the City of Edmonton, where she was the Director of Multicultural Relations. She also served for 5 years as Director of Communications for Legal Aid Alberta, and prior to that, she spent several years overseas working on development and social action projects dedicated to empowering women. She is passionate about immigration and settlement issues with a special interest in ensuring that women are provided with equitable access to services and community support. She holds a Bachelor of Applied Communications degree from Mount Royal University and a Master's in Intercultural and International Communications from Royal Roads University. Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. Am I good? Just want to make sure you can hear me. Okay, we had problems earlier. Okay, I just want to start off by first acknowledging with respect that I sit here in my office at CVIMS on the traditional territories of the Nanaimo First Nation, and I am proud to be living, breathing, playing on this beautiful land. As Aimee or Hannah mentioned, I have been here for about 3.5 years in Nanaimo. I want to start off a little bit by saying, I'm going to take this perspective more from an immigrant newcomer perspective. A lot of what we've heard, especially from Hawa and Aimee, is speaking a lot to around racialized women. And the immigrant experience is also a little bit more specific and different. To let you know, from our agency's perspective, we actually serve more women than men. Yes, we do, which people find surprising. Immigrant women come to this agency, the young women that come with the families as well. So we're at about 25% more women than we are men. And the important thing here to think about is, how do they come here? They come here depending on their immigrant status: permanent resident, temporary foreign worker, international student, and many of them are not permanent residents. So that puts immigrant women in a particularly precarious situation with their immigration status. And so many of you have heard of organizations, regions, cities becoming safe harbor cities. This can be particularly important for immigrant women who fear systems, barriers, hospitals, police, etc., and the ability to call them and saying they're in trouble, wanting to escape from a family violence situation. This in particular puts them in a greater risk at homelessness. And I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to be one of those people today. I'm going to share my screen. I have a little bit of a visual presentation for you, just because I prefer to speak this way in a lot of ways. And so for me, I'm going to take the context of homelessness, and we've referenced it already, in that it is not necessarily being homeless. It can be referred to a situation of instability, lack of permanent or appropriate housing, which I think is extremely important for immigrant women. As Hawa mentioned already, it's lack of security. And many of these women are in a housing situation where there is lack of personal safety, unsafe neighborhoods, inaccessibility of those basic services. And I mentioned that due to fear, especially if it comes to immigration status. Transportation is significant for immigrant women. Larger families, cost of transportation, proximity to work or schools. That's also making a housing situation particularly less secure. Social or physical isolation in their housing situation. Are they around community supports? Other factors that would affect their child development. So if you're looking at housing security, women are looking at these when they're looking at housing. And if these are not met, it is not necessarily secure housing. I want to make a bit of a comparison between immigrant women and the specific different vulnerabilities to Canadian born. And I'm not going to take away from the issues that Canadian born women have when it comes to housing and homelessness, because they are significant. They both look at similarities, such as going through that major life event, domestic violence. Many women are a paycheck away from homelessness. And that's important for us to always understand, that absolute poverty, the mental or physical mental problems and exploitive relationships. And again, I talk about that loss of employment and affordability of housing. I don't think anybody in this panel, in this room, in this town, in this country can argue that affordability is, I can't even describe it. As a Canadian born woman, I find it almost unaffordable for housing. Differences emerge, however, for immigrant women, especially racialized women, when you're looking at specific structural barriers. And Hawa mentioned these, it's significant. Systemic issues when it comes to immigrant women, in particular racialized, we need to do something. The ability to afford safe housing due to employment barriers. And again, that comes to being compared to Canadian born. Language, lack of Canadian work experience. And again, they don't understand their rights. They don't feel comfortable. My time at Legal Aid was, again, very eye-opening. Very few women would want to access the legal system. Very few women had access to the legal system. And especially if you're suffering from a family violence situation, there are very few services here. Maybe not in Nanaimo, we could always have more. And especially the agencies here who do service women are, from my perspective, underfunded, under-resourced, and women are still, especially immigrant women, still need a bit more information about them to feel safe going in. The systemic piece for immigrant women, I will mention again, fear of police, fear of losing their children, fear of child and family services. All of these are real issues for women, and especially if they're in a precarious housing situation. If they think they're going to lose their children, they will not call. Simple. I don't think any of us can talk about the need for anti-racism work and funding towards anti-racism. Not funding. We don't need funding. I don't mean to sound, we just need action. We need women in this panel, women in this community, women in this country to speak out against it and be advocates, be allies for each other. And for me, it's not necessarily a funding piece. It is when it comes to our children, it is when it comes to education, it is when it comes to curriculum. But let's start there. Let's start with educating our children, ourselves, and be advocates and allies for one another, especially when it comes to racialized women. I did a bit of a chart here. So I didn't do a chart, I stole the chart, but this is a bit a kind of a busy visual. And this is more attuned to a family violence situation, but many women will find them in a area of homelessness from a family violence perspective, and for newcomer women especially. So this is the pre-migration piece for them here, is like, come to Canada, let me get a house. Well, that's a bit hard right now. And I'll tell you right now, when it comes to trying to house our families here in Nanaimo, from the Multicultural Society perspective, it is very difficult. It is very difficult to find landlords who will accept immigrants. And I'll say this from a racialized perspective. So it's very hard to find housing, period, let alone for women and their children. And then they'll see themselves in a family violence situation. Multiple attempts to leave. Either through employment, affordability, it's your partner. And many of us who have been in situations who have been in a violent relationship, it's hard to leave. It's not hard to leave because of homelessness. It's hard to leave because of many emotional and attachment reasons. The hidden homeless piece is important. We've already talked about this. Many women are not homeless per se. They are couch surfing. They are staying at friends' houses. They are living in their cars. They are, and they won't be reported. You won't find them. And that's the key piece here. And the outreach on a part of our organizations and our institutions is extremely important. Aimee talked about this a lot. And even as an outreach worker, you're not comfortable. You're not sure. You don't want to put a woman in a situation where she feels ostracized, where she feels embarrassed. Aimee said herself, she didn't want to go knock on people's windows to see, how are you doing today? Did you just sleep in your car? Because maybe, I don't know, you were tired. I've pulled over before and had a nap. So at the end of the day, what is going on with the hidden homeless situation here? We don't count it. We don't see it. We don't know about it. It's significant when it comes to immigrant women, especially. And then you've got all your different, again, the hidden homeless, family, friends, many cultures that are, I'll tell you, first of all, our largest cultures that come to Nanaimo are from China, Syria, Korea, India, and we've got quite a few now coming in from the Sudan and Eritrea, which is amazing. But a lot of this is your family and your friends do support you. You reach out to your communities. You go there first before you go anywhere else. And then the violence, et cetera. But here is the piece here, the factors influencing housing insecurity, so that everybody wants that ability to live independently. The social support networks that we need to give to women, put their children in a safe situation. So I'm not saying that not all women want their children in a safe situation, but immigrant women in particular, especially those with precarious immigration status, are more vulnerable to this situation. They are more afraid, again, of losing their children. They don't know the systems. They don't know where they fit. And they'll say, if anything, they'll stay in the situation because of their children. Language and literacy is significant for women, not Canadian born in particular. And so we have many women come here, the language barrier, it's a barrier. It's a barrier to employment. It's a barrier when getting housing. It's a barrier when looking for supports. And so how can we as organizations support this? Well, we do need to have a little bit more training, exposure to cultural competency training. How do we work with women from different countries? How do we communicate better? What are the different cultural nuances that we need to understand as service providers? And advocacy is another piece. How are we going to advocate on behalf of these women? How are we going to get to understand their situations better? And then teach ourselves what it is that we need to do as a community to become more interdependent. And what I mean by that, food security is significant when it comes to homelessness and housing. We don't think of it in a way that it is, but food security is important for women too in a homeless and housing situation. And so
Jennifer,
I
you
will
have just
finish.
over
I
a
know, I'm
minute
going to
left.
finish now. Thanks, Hannah. So at the end of the day, this is a forum for conversations. This is a forum for advocacy, and this is a forum for us as women to move ahead together and support us. I'll finish there, Hannah.
Great.
Thank you so much. I'm going to let Melissa introduce our next speaker.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Jennifer, for reminding us, and all of the speakers so far are reminding us of the many different layers and distinctions that women are facing, right? It's not a universal experience that women we don't have universal experiences. There are shared common grounds on some levels, but there's a lot of distinctions we need to prioritize and pay attention to. Our next speaker is Michèle Biss, who's a project manager of the National Right to Housing Network, a group of over 300 individuals and organizations who are dedicated to the meaningful implementation of the right to housing in Canada. As an expert in economic and social rights, she has presented at several United Nations treaty body reviews and at Canadian parliamentary committees. Prior to her work at the NRHN, Michèle was the policy director and human rights lawyer at Canada Without Poverty. In 2016, she graduated from the advanced course on economic, social, and cultural rights at Abo Akademi University in Finland. She has extensive professional experience working for marginalized groups, particularly women, persons with disabilities, newcomers, and Indigenous persons through casework, research, community legal education. I couldn't memorize it all. In her local Ottawa community, she sits on the board of directors of Ottawa Community Legal Services, and she's a human rights lawyer and was called to the Ontario Bar in 2014. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to apologize right ahead of time before I start speaking. I hope that you enjoy some nice toddler background noise because currently it is Sunday evening where I am. And so fingers crossed that he is distracted by Paw Patrol and doesn't run into this presentation midway. So I am joining today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Very important to note, I think, for those of us here in the capital, because I am just a short drive away from the House of Commons, from Parliament, a seat of power that has perpetrated institutional violence against Indigenous persons for many, many generations and continues to do so. So I note the context of joining, and I'm thankful to be here on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe and reflecting in that in my comments. So in thinking about my presentation today and what I wanted to add to the discussion, I think there's a lot that's gone forward about the intersections of homelessness, causes of homelessness. And so what I'd like to do through my comments is really focus on a story, an advocacy story, a story of resilience that gives me a lot of hope for how we can address these big systemic issues. I'll tell you, my background is as a human rights lawyer. I started my career working in legal clinics, actually as well, Jennifer. I worked in many legal clinics and had the opportunity to do lots of work on behalf of a lot of women in particular who had experienced violent crime, women who were living in poverty, women who had experienced homelessness and were denied social benefits. And as a result of all of that work, I got to see firsthand, as I think many of our other panelists have, how deep some of the systemic barriers are that drive homelessness, that drive Canada's housing crisis, and felt the frustration of a lack of action to address those big systemic issues, to often be calling for very similar things and not see the needle shift in terms of housing. And from there, I became very involved in the right to housing movement and the human rights movement. Often when I talk about the right to housing, people say, great, cool idea. That makes me feel very inspired. What do you do with the right to housing? And what's interesting is that in reality, Canada has signed on to a number of international human rights treaties, including the Covenant on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, a number of other treaties that commit us to the right to housing and the right to housing at all levels of government. So it's a federal government obligation, but it's also provincial, territorial, local government obligation to fulfill. But somehow in Canada, we have, through our domestic law, through our domestic policy, we've really prioritized civil and political rights. So think of it this way. For someone to be denied the right to vote, that would be a gross violation. We would all jump on that. Or someone to be denied the opportunity for freedom of speech. Of course, people have access to these rights, but somehow we've delegated economic, social, and cultural rights like the right to housing, like the right to food, like the right to health. And so for a number of years, many advocates had been pushing for realization of the right to housing. So how do we create an instrument, a thing that people can sink their teeth into to be able to exercise the right to housing so we can address these really big systemic barriers? And I wanted to tell you a little bit about a case called the Tanijaja, or the right to housing case. I don't know how many folks are familiar with this one, but I think it's a really good example of how hard it's been to realize the right to housing in Canada. So what happened was in about the early 2010s, we saw 3 individual applicants and 1 institutional applicant, so an organization, make an application at the Ontario Superior Court to say that the Government of Canada had violated the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms based on Section 7, life, liberty, and security of the person, and Section 15, which is around equality rights. And they had done this by failing to implement a national or provincial housing strategy. And this was an application for both the Ontario government and the federal government. Now, a whole bunch of people got around this case. There was 9,000 pages of evidence that were filed to say that, that the government had this obligation to do this through the charter. And lo and behold, the attorneys general filed what's called a motion to strike. Now, you use a motion to strike in litigation when someone files an application that is so frivolous and vexatious, so out of here, ridiculous, and the judge agreed with the motion, and it was struck despite tons and tons of evidence coming forward. And then again, this went to the Ontario Court of Appeal, and in a 2-to-1 decision, they agreed the motion to strike would stand. So the the court would not just say there is no right to housing protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They said, we don't even care enough to talk about it. We don't even care enough to explore or pretend that we really care about this. Now, I tell this story because it's important to remember the way that institutions and our colonial governments and systems have shut the door to the right to housing, have shut the door to a way for people to exercise these rights. There's a lot of playing of lip service, I think, as a lot of our panelists have talked about in relation to the right to housing. A lot of contexts where we'll say, we'll acknowledge that institutional racism exists, we'll acknowledge that these systemic drivers of homelessness exist, but not a lot of action to really urge advocacy, to urge accountability and transparency in government decision-making. Now, the part of the good part of the story, the actual resilience part, now that I've bummed everybody out a whole lot. So what makes me really happy is that in 2019, after this long history of advocacy, we saw the passing of the National Housing Strategy Act. The National Housing Strategy Act is a piece that was pushed for by advocates across the country for many, many decades. It came after some significant amendments that were pushed by different people. And really, in particular, what we have in that act is these 2 mechanisms. One is this mechanism to create a federal housing advocate, and another mechanism is to create a national housing council. And what the idea is that a federal housing advocate will be able to hear systemic claims from people. So rights claimants, when we see these major barriers in laws, policies, and programs, so for example, the fact that we have a national housing strategy that has allocated 25% of funding to women, girls, and gender gender diverse persons, and there is no way to measure that, no accountability around where those dollars are actually going, that's a systemic claim that we can ask the federal housing advocate to look into. They can investigate that systemic claim, and then they make recommendations that go on to the Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development. When something is really egregious, they can then ask the National Housing Council to form a review panel of 3 persons with technical right to housing expertise, with people with lived experience of inadequate housing and homelessness, to form a review panel and to actually hold a public hearing to talk about systemic issues, to bring them forward, to exercise the right to housing. And then those recommendations go off to the Minister of Families, Children, Social Development again. And what's really exciting for policy nerds out there is that they have to table that response in the House of Commons and the Senate. So why I say all this is finally there is this way that we can make the right to housing live through this specific federal mechanism. And I'm really excited about it because of the issues that I think we could start to talk about and start to use through this, kind of quasi-judicial mechanism, this way to actually exercise and really shift our thinking away from the idea that the right to housing is a nice idea to an actual exercisable, accountable thing. It gives us an opportunity to talk about the intersections of the child welfare system and homelessness, particularly for Indigenous women, and the lack of programs to help people who are aging out of care and instead falling into homelessness. It helps us think about ways that we can more adequately measure homelessness. And one of the big systems issues is that we often focus on populations who are experiencing visible homelessness, who might be living rough or using shelters. And has been mentioned many times throughout the presentations today, we know that women are more often experiencing hidden homelessness, living in their cars, living in family violence because of a lack of options. It also gives us an opportunity to talk about affordability of housing. So why is housing not affordable? What kind of housing are our levels of government investing in? Are they investing in property to build property to build property to make money? Or are they building in affordable housing options with specific affordability criteria, particularly in neighborhoods that we know are disproportionately experiencing homelessness among Black populations, Indigenous populations, and looking also at some of these big systems issues, like when a woman is told that she can't have her children back from child welfare services because she doesn't have a 2-bedroom unit through social housing, and social housing tells her she can't have her 2-bedroom unit until she gets her kids back. Now that's very much a more provincial issue, more provincial government issue, but what we can do through the National Housing Strategy Act is start to figure out where these big systems gaps are and how we could apply the right to housing and international human rights law to really urge action. And so that's what a lot of the work that I'm doing has to do with. The National Right to Housing Network. We're a group that's very much established to hold the government's feet to the fire as they create these mechanisms to make sure that they're strong and really built in the right to housing and international human rights. And secondly, to start figuring out where those cases are. So anyone have any cases? If you have cases or ideas to build, please let me know, because I think right now what it's all about is making sure that really strong systemic issues are being brought forward so that we can use this mechanism to urge action, especially for women who have experienced so many violations of their human right to housing for so long.
Thank you so very much. I particularly find it helpful, and I think many of us would as concerned citizens, to have some of these practical strategies and the information and updates around things that we can do and how the questions that we can ask. And when I post the recording of this, I will also make sure that I include some links and information to some of these organizations and websites so that people can learn more and follow and track the progress on that. So thank you so much. I'll pass it on to Hannah to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Renelle Bozeman, Samaritan Program Director for Samaritan Women's Housing, Island Crisis Care Society. Originally from South Africa and now a Canadian citizen who has lived in Canada for 25 years, Renelle manages several programs under the umbrella of Samaritan House Women's Housing, including Prideaux Men's Housing, Martha's Place Supportive Housing, Mary's Place Transitional Housing Services, and a rent subsidy program. She has been with Island Crisis Care Society for 11 years, and she has worked in the field as a trained social worker for 15 years. She has worked with vulnerable new moms and babies as an outreach worker and in second stage shelter for women. She is passionate about working with women at risk.
Got it now. Thanks, Hannah. I really appreciate to be part of this team and feel very blessed that I was invited. I am here to learn from everybody else, and I'm looking forward to also hear from the other expertise. Working with women specifically at risk, my passion for that started when I came to Canada and worked for 6 years in Saskatchewan with young moms, and then 4 years in a second stage shelter for with a lot of immigrants and refugees. And I think there's so many similarities, but there's also differences that we all already heard. One thing that really stands out for me now that I've worked in women's emergency shelter for 11 years is the fact that it's not just the home, that they don't have a home. It's not just that they don't feel safe. It has such a bigger and a deeper effect. The mental, emotional impact on women and how it impacts their self-esteem is really so big. There's shame and there's a lot of feelings that people deal with that's homeless. Some of the barriers, we've already touched on a few of those. I feel that women's homelessness is definitely undercounted and it's underfunded. And I think also there need to be more investigation, more programs to really see what it is about. I've seen at the shelter that we are sort of the last resort for women of different circumstances, educated, people that's less educated, people in addiction, mental health, people with developmental challenges, people leaving the foster care that has no specific plan and just forced into homelessness because there's no plan, there's no continuing, where do I go, what do I do? So people end up at the shelter. And people are also trapped in the shelter because one of the barriers to homelessness is our economy. It's poverty, it's wages, it's the high rent. So people get trapped. People have lived in the shelter for so many years because there's no option to get out. We have 2 outreach workers through Island Crisis Care Society that really work on a case plan that really help people to see what is their needs for housing and how we can support them to permanent long-term housing. And a lot of the women is just not capable of moving out and live on their own. With our rent subsidy programs that I'm so thankful for, it really support people in a big way. But even with a rent subsidy, when we give them that extra amount to function, they still have not enough money to live on. They don't have transportation, they don't have enough food money, they don't have enough money for medication. So they get trapped in the shelter system. Another thing that I really has been coming very prominent is that we have women older than 55 that is homeless and end up in shelters. They do not fit the criteria to access any of the seniors housing at any point. So if they're not 75 and able to really pay and have safe seniors housing, they are also trapped in a shelter system where we are not always equipped to help them with their need of, there's usually lots of health challenges, mobility. Sometimes it's a combination of mental health and addiction. So it is really something, long-term care. There's no options for long-term care when you have people with all those challenges under 65. So, since we moved from a women's emergency shelter to a temporary emergency response center because of COVID, we have seen that there is so much more needed than just a place, a bed in a shelter or a housing. There's really more integrated teams necessary. There's home support that's needed. There's mental health nurses needed there, and everybody sort of function individual, and to get those supports into the home where you live or where the person live is so challenging. There's challenges to, we just got actually, Island Health just assigned a nurse to us, and I cannot tell you how much and that support has meant to us, because there was somebody that would come in daily. She's building a relationship with these women, and relationship building is so important, because you can't just say, well, you need to trust me and you need to follow what I think is good for you. That people need to trust you. So the nurse is checking in, she sits and she has an opportunity to talk to these women, and the support and how she's navigating and helping us with this complex needs that's now part of a shelter that we don't have that type of support. Is really, so I really think there should be more specified housing for women, not just a shelter. There's definitely long-term care, there's for complex health needs, and a team approach to have these teams. I really think in the long term, that is going to save the government money to have these type of supports on site. I quickly just want to mention, talking about resilience, I just want to talk about my own memory of the last 11 years working in a shelter for abused women. There's lovely stories to tell how people with their attitudes and their drive that they have, how they came through all the trauma, all the pain, all the challenges that homelessness brought to them, and how they've moved on. I know some of them are working in this field now with other women. We had people that was going to university that stayed with us in our homeless shelter, and she finished her course that she did. We had women that went working daily, active in addiction, homeless, but came to us, stayed. And I just feel that I learn every day through these women's stories, through their resilience. And I think we should listen more to women that's homeless. We should listen to their needs. We should listen to what they think will work for them, instead of just putting out things that we think should work. We started at Island Crisis Care Society with the emergency shelter, and then realize that there is more need. It's either, so people go to treatment, they end the treatment, or they end detox, and now they're waiting for treatment. And the option is you are just back into a low barrier shelter where you get triggered all over again. And then that doesn't help homelessness, because they're just going around in circles, go out, come back, and there's nothing to sort of support them. So we started a supportive units where people can actually move from the shelter to supportive units. And all of this is 24/7 staffing. And from there, they can move into transition housing in a different part of the community, where they still have support, live independently, more independently. And we've seen how people have built relationships with their families, how they started going back to school, how they found jobs. And then from there, the opportunity to have a rent subsidy and move into rent subsidy. The positive aspect of this type of housing, I think, is when people move forward and, mental health challenges is not always stable. So they have sort of a setback, and then that opportunity to take them back to something else, but still in a very safe and familiar environment where they know the staff, where they know what we are about, and then give them an opportunity to, gather himself, to take the next step, and then move slowly forward. I really think that since we started doing that, that revolving door of people coming into the shelter and go out, try, market housing and fail because there's so much barriers around that. People don't have references. They don't have damage deposits. They try, to go on their own by just going with a roommate that they don't know. And then to have that failure and feeling that they failed, then the only option is going back to a emergency shelter. So now the option is supportive housing, where they can have 2 years to help them slowly move through these challenges to get stronger, to help themselves to move into the community. I just feel that there is so much more to learn, and we need to involve these women in a path forward regarding homelessness. The other lack that I really feel very strongly is that there's nothing for women with children. There's not a lot in our community at this point where women and children can be kept safe. Part of the hidden homelessness is, I think, people, a lot of women live in low, in motels. They don't get counted. They leave domestic violence, and they're not seen as homeless women, but they are seen as, people leaving domestic violence, abusive relationships. They don't get counted as homelessness. So I think it's really undercounted, and there's many more people. And I think women are in general more creative and strong to find solutions. But I hope that we can improve through these communications.
Thank you so much. I feel like every single speaker is reminding us of several additional things that we may not have noticed or realized. And thank you especially for bringing up the aging population of women that don't quite fit into those categories, certain categories, right? So those are so important, such important reminders. We'll have our final speaker, and then hopefully a time for a couple of questions. Stacey Middlemiss is a registered psychiatric nurse and city councillor who lives and works in the Cowichan Valley, where she's passionate about supporting people where they're at in the most respectful and dignified way possible. Stacey takes pride in being a voice for the people she serves and is grateful for everything they've taught her over the years. In recovery herself, Stacey uses her innate understanding of the trials and tribulations of addiction to connect with and understand those she serves. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you, Melissa. I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territory of the Cowichan people. And I want to say how grateful I am to be here in the presence of all of these amazing women. And, I raise my hands to you all. This is not an easy field to work in. And I think as women, we often are judged, and we're called bleeding hearts, and we wear our heart on our sleeve, and people think that we're too sensitive or whatnot, but it takes a certain kind of person to be able to do this kind of work. And I'm really in awe of the great people on this panel, and so I thank you. I'm not really here to represent either of my jobs really, but I am a registered psychiatric nurse by trade, and even before that, I've spent many years getting to know the residents of the Cowichan Valley that everyone else kind of seems to push aside or not want to know. And I've learned so much from the amazing people that I serve. And in my job, I've worked in hospital outreach. I managed a homeless shelter. I've run programs for peers. That something I'm really passionate about is, and it's been mentioned today, is about including the voice of the people that are going to use the services that we're providing. And, a lot of programs start out that way, I think, as Michèle mentioned, where, we want your voice and we want to have these certain amount of people at a table, but then over time we lose those people and their voices. And for me, that's actually why I ran for city council, was to be the voice of the people that I served. And, it turns out, I didn't know a lot about being on city council, but it turns out there's a lot of stuff I can't actually, be a voice for, because it's a conflict for my work, right? But I'm fortunate to, here in Duncan, we have an amazing council that is so passionate about homelessness and, really looking for the best ways to move forward for the future, and not just Band-Aids. So I'm really fortunate that I don't actually have to speak out very often, but that is why I had run for city council in the first place. A big part of why I've been successful in the work that I do is because, like, as Michèle or Melissa mentioned, I really try to meet people where they're at. And that's a big part of the work that we do. I'm always asking, how can I support you today? Like, where you're at? How can I help you get as healthy as possible? And then also, what other choices can I make available to you? I think that there's a lot of barriers to housing, as have been mentioned today. And, I think one of the biggest ones I see is just vulnerability. It takes a lot of trust from the clients that I serve, to be able to really to support people through their journey, whatever that may be for them. And I think that, as with COVID, as an example, I think it's brought forth a lot of funding, and it's opened up all these new projects. And, I was talking to a client the other day, and she mentioned, like, how she'd noticed there's more outreach teams on the streets and whatnot, which is great, but there's no real clear vision as to what exactly, how they can help. So they pull up and they ask, like, hey, how are you today? And, and then they're like, well, how can I help you? And this woman was like, well, I could use a couple bucks for a coffee. Oh, well, I can't help you with that. Well, it's like, well, what could you do? Right. And so I think, if we're going to form all these services and whatnot, I think the more we can really work together to serve a purpose, to, get to work those people through their plan, whatever that may be for them. I'm really proud of the work that we've done in Couch in here with housing. We, some of you may have seen, we kind of, we have a hotel and then a few separate sites, and we've kept them kind of small. So some people started in tents, and now we have these little, essentially like an 8x8 shed type thing, and the door locks, and they got heat and electricity and stuff. It's pretty exciting. But just for me, and who I've worked with a lot of these clients for a long time, just seeing that transition, like taking a person who's lived on the streets primarily for many years, even 1 year, and then here's a hotel room or an apartment or whatnot. And if we don't provide the support that goes along with that, it's bound to fail. And that's not the fault of the person that's moving into the housing. It's just, sometimes we can get ahead too if we get more housing than we have the staff and supports to go along with it. And I think Renelle touched on that too, is just, it's not easy. It's not as easy as just giving everybody housing. There's a lot of support that goes with that. And, I think it's about having a balance between, you're going to have some people who don't require a lot of balance or a lot of support, maybe just like a check-in daily, kind of see how they're doing. And then other people who really have never lived indoors on their own. We have people who have aged out, and, this is the first time they've lived on their own. They don't know how to manage their finances or cook a meal or to do a lot of things that we take for granted, right? I think one of the biggest misconceptions about homelessness is that it's easy to get out of. It is hard, and for many reasons. And like I said, I primarily work with people who are absolutely homeless, most of whom who have either mental illness or addictions. And, you know, I see the guilt and the shame, the pride the women have, you know, so it's not just about that lack of housing, but it's so hard to go from nothing to going but I think even just opening up to being vulnerable to say, like, is this real? Is it gonna last? Is it gonna be taken away from me? You know, am I gonna be, you know, nobody wants to be, you know, to have something taken away, I guess, right? So, and then I think too, on top of that, you know, when you've always maybe in the past worked, dealt with your issues by running away or using substances, and now you're moving into a housing, you get this housing, but it's not low barrier or whatnot, and so there's all these barriers to like the kind of like you have to kind of fit in this box to be able to live in this housing, right? And that's such a struggle, that I see, you know, everywhere. Same with, as Renelle mentioned too, like we have some people who are could probably stand to live in some kind of assisted living facility because they need it for their healthcare needs, but they drink alcohol or whatnot, and so they don't fit into this box, and so there's nowhere really for that person. Like they're hanging on by a thread over here where they're living, but is it safe? Probably not, but it's safer than being on the streets, right? And you know, even being a manager at the shelter, sometimes seeing that system of having to, unfortunately, like somebody breaks the rule, you have to give them a break in service, and you're almost doing it to hope that, like, while they're out there, maybe they'll get picked up and go in the ambulance and go to the hospital, because that's the only way to try and get them, like, to get someone to see how sick they are, right? And so it's such a broken system in that way, right? So there's so many things that contribute to homelessness, that I think we often don't think about. I guess I'll just share too, like, you know, we had talked about memories of resilience, and oh man, I'm moved every day by the people that I serve. They are just so resilient. You know, I see the things that they go through in a day, and they get up and they do it again. And you know, it motivates me so much, in my own life to move forward. And you know, I often see too, like some of the women that I serve are just, it's so hard to ask for help and then to fail, you know. In one of the groups that I run, somebody stood up once and talked about he'd gone to treatment and it was great and everyone was so excited, and you know, bells and balloons and everybody's so excited about it. And he came back, and again, everyone was so excited and happy for him, and he was happy. And then, you know, something happened and he relapsed. And even like that first time, it was hard to go back. But and then like kind of the more times you go back, people are less excited. Oh yeah, they kind of lose faith in you. And I had never really thought about that, like how hard. And I see that in particular in a lot of the women, it's just their ability to stand up and ask for help again after they failed last time. And you know, a lot, like I probably 90% of the women I serve have children, and I see how hard it is for them to be away from them, and knowing that somebody else is raising their kids, but they just can't seem to get to that next level to get them back. And yeah, just the resilience it moves me every day. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks again so much for inviting me to be here today.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and thanks for reminding us of that deeply intimate, personal, human experience every single day, and how human this struggle is, as opposed to thinking of it just as a statistical problem or something that's distant from us. But this is very empathetic storytelling there. Thank you very much. I realize that everybody's time is short, and so if anybody does have to leave, I deep respect for that. But I did want to open up the possibility for a maximum of 10 more minutes for discussion, and I completely respect if anyone needs to leave. So if that's okay with that in mind, I do want to thank every single one of these speakers and remind you that the recording will be posted on the VIUFA.ca page, as well as the VIUFA Status of Women page, and I'll also have resources and additional information posted there as well. So I'll pass it over to Hannah, because I think she just wanted to open with a question for the panel.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. You know, a lot of our panelists today reflected on the effects that COVID-19 has had, particularly how it's disproportionately affected women. Hawa specifically reminded us that as a pandemic recovery takes off, that the most vulnerable women are most likely to be left behind. So as we build a pandemic recovery, what does a just, inclusive pandemic recovery mean for women, specifically women who are experiencing homelessness? And what would you like to see in that recovery? And I'll open that up to anyone from the panel to speak to.
I'll do something really fast. Hello? Sorry. From the perspective of COVID, and it's not necessarily related to homelessness, but for women's perspective, the newcomer women in particular, COVID has significantly affected their employment progression. And so that ability to maintain employment, progress with their accreditation or with whatever skill set they might have, and childcare. So childcare has been significant for women in particular, and newcomer women who wanted to progress in any way to become more sustainably and long-term employed, and again, affecting their access to housing. So for me, the employment piece we need to focus on, and daycare, so that they can progress in that way. Daycare is significant.
Great, thank you. Hawa, did you want to respond to that one too?
Yeah, I mean, so I have a lot of thoughts. Maybe I'll reflect on one, which is I think we need to start thinking about and valuing lived experience as expertise. So I think we actually need to consider it a competency as opposed to a criteria, which means that we should be putting front and center the women that we know will be left behind. This idea that we have of speaking for or on behalf of, we know this, right? If you've done any work in any kind of gender equality work, if you've done any research, we know this, the speaking for actually just needs to take a back seat, and people need to really think about the makeup of their organizations. They need to think about who's in senior leadership positions, who's at the executive level, and there needs to be, because we know women who reflect the women who are experiencing the greatest amount of marginalization often make different decisions around services. Like we know this, the evidence points to it. We've seen it over time. So I would say we need to there needs to be some concrete action, and it could be something that folks who are here today could also engage with. Do I look like the folks that I'm serving? Does anybody who works at a senior leadership team in my organization look like the folks that I'm serving? When and how can we value people sharing their stories as credible competencies and expertise that actually, if we're not from a community, we just don't have that level of competency in a particular area, regardless of professional experience.
Thank you, Hawa. And I just wanted to really reflect on that too, is that it's so important that we also be compensating that expertise. I know that it's common that we go to people with lived experience and ask them to give their opinion in a survey or to speak as a presenter, but have them in those positions of leadership, have them as employees, as staff, as leaders. Make sure that those people are compensated for their experience and for their contributions. We haven't received any further questions in the chat at this time. Is anyone else interested in speaking on the subject of COVID-19 specific impacts and recovery before we move on?
I can speak to the federal government piece, maybe, just to kind of expand it outward into something really concrete. I think one thing that's really interesting in the national advocacy space is that COVID has forced us to have some hard conversations. And as a couple of colleagues have pointed out, one of the biggest intersecting issues with some of the worst things that have happened with COVID have been related to housing, whether we're looking at people who've been incarcerated, whether we're looking at long-term care homes, whether we're looking at homeless shelters, that there's no question that we can't be pushing housing and homelessness to the side. And that we also can't be looking at it as only throwing programs and services at it instead of thinking about the really big systemic issues. And I think the big thing that I know I'm going to be looking for in the federal budget that will be coming out in the next month or so is, are we spending money on housing and homelessness? Are we doing that with a view to the systemic drivers, particularly for particular populations? It's great if we're building, but are we asking the question, who are we building for? And how do we make sure that the capital that we're putting forward, the programs that were being created are actually impacting people? And how do we make sure that those people have not just voice, but access to their rights, can claim their rights and get the accountability in their hands to be able to push forward more progressive housing policy as we move forward past COVID?
And we have 5 minutes left, just in honor of not wanting to take up too much more time. So Hannah, did you have one other final question maybe before we wrap up?
Yeah, this comes a little bit from my personal experience. I work at a child and family services organization and a child safety team. And so I'm in that child protection, child welfare role that some of you have mentioned, especially Michèle made reference to this. And I'm curious about the unique needs of mothers who are homeless. Quite often they're separated from their children and having a difficult time maintaining connection. In order to have access to their children, they're required to have a safe place to have that access, and they simply don't have that. Or they can't be reunited with their children because of that housing piece again that was mentioned. I'm just curious to hear everyone's thoughts on the unique intersection of motherhood and homelessness.
Can I make a very quick comment that was something that was really striking to me when working in the shelter system, was that shelter system is for 16 to 24-year-old young people, and it is not intended for children, small children, right? And so very often you have young women who will find themselves pregnant, and if they disclose that they're pregnant, they face an increased amount of pressure to leave the youth shelter. And that pressure is coming from the city, like municipal partners or provincial partners or whoever, because the requirements around who can stay in a youth shelter do not account for any children. And so if there's nowhere to go, right, so you have to have a physical child to get into a family shelter, right? So oftentimes, particularly young women are quite stuck in terms of where they're going to go and what they're going to do. So like, I can't even count the number of experiences where a young person is giving birth, and if they go into the hospital to give birth and they don't have a place of residence to put on their application, child welfare will get involved and likely apprehend the child. So it's a cacophony of like terrible things, and it's all systemic. None of it is related to the young person, what they may need. It's all systemic. It's at every turn, it's an institution blocking access, and it's all predicated on housing. So I think there needs to be many more rapid response housing environments, particularly for people who find themselves stuck between a number of institutions.
I think too, I've heard a lot of stories too about mothers who are doing their best. They are housed, and then they can't pay, a hydro bill or something. And instead of helping them pay that hydro bill, again, we take their kids away. And then, and that's a huge part of the amount of the clients that I serve is, they didn't start using drugs or alcohol until they had their kids taken away. And then that was how they coped with it, right? And so it's this vicious cycle. And it's so hard for them to get their kids back when we could have maybe just paid their hydro bill, offered some support and education around maybe some like helping with finances and management, something that was probably cost us, the government, way less in the first place. Then and then it's just such a terrible cycle.
I just wanted to say it just didn't bring in one of our attendees here. The last two comments from Sonnet Labe. We need more talk about settler colonialism, land grabs, land grants, zoning and property laws, who gets to build and have housing. More talk about racism and how it's is about who you are seen as a legitimate property owner in settler colonialism. Think about the language of go home and who sees who's implying whose home is whose and that sort of thing. So another really important piece to that. Are there any final thoughts or parting thoughts that our panelists want to share with us before we wrap this session up? That just feels like it's only beginning, but it's also heavy and also important to have some self-care and time to reflect after so much information and thoughts you've given us. Any final parting thoughts that any of you wanted to share? Okay, well, Jennifer, were you wanting to say something there? Or okay.
Just thank you.
Thank you. Okay, absolutely. I know every city has contentious battles and struggles and concerns regarding the issue of affordable housing right now, and unsafe, or whether the struggles and challenges to get safe housing. There's a lot of misinformation and frankly racism associated with homelessness, a lot of isms associated with it. This is obviously just one of many panels, and we need more than just panels. We need people organizing and looking at who's leading in their local communities, and it builds up from there. So thank you for giving us a lot to think about. I know for me, I'm going to especially be thinking about this question of rebuilding going forward. What does it look like? We know that from in situations of crisis, people get fatigue, they get amnesia. they just want things to be back to normal in their own environment. But a lot of people say it'll be a new normal, and I just hope this will be a society where we don't forget these things and that we prioritize anti-racism, feminism, and yes, compassion. So I thank you all very much for all the work you do. As I said, this event is about raising awareness and inspiring action, but also to honor the incredible work that these panelists have done, and many other people here who've joined this event and people who aren't even here. So thank you, everybody. And look out for that recording that you can watch that will be posted this week. I appreciate your time. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.